Now, the 1924 Constitution was the first constitution of a normal republican system, which adopted the principle of legislative supremacy, a unicameral legislature, no upper chamber, just one chamber, National Assembly, and the Constitution de-emphasized decentralization of the 1921 Constitution, which opened up the way of reverting back to centralism, central rule at the national level, and until 1930s, no major attempt at defining the local governments or local administration in Turkey was made. In 1930, a new law was promulgated, which defined the status of the local administration, did not differentiate between the role of a governor and the mayor of the larger city of the province. So until the end of the 50s, the mayors and the governors were the same individuals in most occasions, and they managed both affairs of the province and at the same time the bigger city, and were appointed by the center. So the centralism continued all the way until the 1961 Constitution, overwhelmingly. From 1925, when there was the famous Sheikh Said rebellion in the east, where a Kurdish Naqshbandi sheikh rose up against the state and was able to receive a considerable amount of support from his followers, the regime shifted from multi-party politics towards one-party pragmatism with a political party that was not, in essence, very ideological or doctrinaire in the same sense that the one-party systems of the time, Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, or Stalin's Soviet Union had been. But it was still a one-party system in which the party controlled the state, the legislature, the executive branches of the government, and the judiciary was also under the shadow of the one-party government until 1945. In 1945, due to domestic developments, which we have covered, where during the Second World War, especially black marketeering created a new class of entrepreneurs, accumulated a lot of wealth on not necessarily fully legitimate grounds, found themselves in need of protection from the potential wrath of the Republican People's Party after the war, sought for protection by a new political party emerging and defying the order of the Republican People's Party domestically. And internationally, Turkey faced a much more cumbersome relationship with the Soviet Union. Its friendly ties, which had continued until 1946, thanks to a friendship treaty signed between Lenin and Atatürk in 1921, which was in effect for 25 years until 1946, had to be renegotiated for either its termination or extension. And before the end of that 25-year term, in 1945, when the Turkish diplomats tested the waters in Moscow, they got the impression that Stalin was developing new ideas in relations between Turkey and the Soviet Union and was moving in the direction of turning this relationship of one of hegemony by the Soviets over the Turkish Republic, requesting changes in borders on the northeastern part of the country back to the Russo-Ottoman border of 1870s to a certain extent, demanding certain provinces such as Kars and Ardahan for Russia, or Georgian Republic of the Soviets, however you may want to put it, and also deployment of Red Army troops on both sides of the straits, both the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, to protect Turkey against potential foreign threat. And none of these were acceptable, but at this position that the government was, Turkey was pretty much isolated. Turkey had not taken part in the war, had not taken sides, had been neutral until the very end. As I told you earlier, Turkey declared war on Germany in February 1945, when practically Germany was defeated. It took another couple of months before Germany finally officially accepted defeat and was in no position to create any major challenge to the Turkish landmass by February 1945. But this was not thought to be good enough in the eyes of the victorious powers of the Second World War. However, they were not in a position to think about punishing Turkey for becoming neutral during the war either. So there was a period of suspense for Turkish foreign policy in which Turkey was left alone to deal with the challenge of the Soviets. It didn't take very long for the British and then the Americans to discover that Stalin was not necessarily so much concerned about Turkey, but Middle East further south because of the oil under the control of the newly developing independent states of the Middle East. Iraq, especially in the north, Kirkuk, Mosul became important areas with oil, also further south in Basra. And a new state of the Kurds was established as a potential protectorate of the Soviet system in Mahabad. And there were also some Russian presence in northern Iran. And therefore, they had to take precautions about countering the Soviet challenge towards the Middle East, and Turkey started to emerge as a potential ally in this case. And furthermore, to the immediate west of Turkey, in Greece, a civil war had erupted between the communists and the right-wingers in Greece, and Bulgaria, already solidly in the Soviet camp, was aiding the socialists in Greece, and the situation was becoming dire under these circumstances. So if Greece had become a part of the Warsaw Pact eventually, and Turkey became marginalized and colonized by the Soviets, a new challenge in the Middle East from these victorious Soviets of the Second World War could not be that easily to contain or deter. So in 1947, the Americans adopted a policy of support for Greece and Turkey known as the Truman Doctrine. It was the American President Truman who declared this doctrine. But even before that, Turkey had declined the offers of Stalin, did not renew the old friendship and non-aggression treaty with Moscow, and started to look for ways of somehow joining the Club of Democracies in the world in 1945. And that pushed for major changes in the system. By which time, 4 major members of the Democrat Party had already made scathing criticisms of the CHP government in a written declaration headed by Celal Bayar Adnan Menderes, youngest of them all, and then Refik Koraltan and Fuat Köprülü, who came from a family of Grand Viziers who had served with fame the Ottoman Empire a few centuries earlier, and a professor of history. He has written extensively on Ottoman history, and his books are still relevant. These four had moved out of the Republican People's Party, resigning their positions in the Republican People's Party, and eventually established the Democrat Party. Celal Bayar, after 1950, became the president. Adnan Menderes became the prime minister. Refik Koraltan became the speaker of the Grand National Assembly. Fuat Köprülü became the foreign minister for a while. So out of the organization of the Republican People's Party emerged the Democrat Party. But that was not the first party to be established. It was the National Development Party, or Milli Kalkınma Partisi, established by a businessman, Mr. Demirağ, Nuri Demirağ, who had been a manufacturer of planes in the 1930s. He had established a manufacturing plant and started to produce planes, airplanes, in the 1930s. A very entrepreneurial individual. His party was the first party, but that party did not necessarily receive the kind of support that the Democrats did. And that, however, is indicative of the fact where the hearts of the business community lay, not with the Republican People's Party, but with the opposition. And the opposition was eventually led by the Democrats. A more nationalist party called the Nation Party, Millet Partisi, emerged eventually in late 1940s, 1948, if I'm not mistaken, to be headed by the Marshal Fevzi Çakmak, actually an instructor of Kemal Atatürk himself, and he was the only soldier who served both in the Ottoman and also the Republican Army as the chief of staff. He had been the chief of staff of the Ottoman Army, and then he became the chief of staff of the Turkish Army during the War of Independence. So very important person, immaculate characters, very conservative individual, and he became the symbol of the conservatives. But he died the same year, 1948, and therefore the Nation Party had difficulty vying for power as opposed to the Democrats. Now, 1950, elections, as I told you last time we met, was the first election that was supervised by the judiciary. It was considerably fair, it was considerably free, as a result of which the Democrats were able to come to power where not much vote rigging was possible, and majority of the people voted for the Democrats and pushed them into ascendancy. And they came to rule the country until the 1960 coup. Turkey developed either a predominant party or a two-party system in which two political parties played a major role. The Democrat Party, established by these gentlemen, versus the Republican People's Party, CHP, of the former times, led by İsmet İnönü. Who had served as the prime minister for a long time under Kemal Atatürk's presidency and the one-party era. And upon his death in 1938, when Celal Bayar was the prime minister, Celal Bayar decided to suggest that İnönü becomes the president, and he won the presidency, the votes for the presidency in the Republican People's Party dominated parliament very easily. And in 1938 became the president of the country and stayed there in that post until 1950. Second president of the country. The third president became Bayar after 1950. But the two, as I already mentioned to you earlier, established some kind of a pact, an understanding that transition to multi-party politics will have certain limits and contours of its own. And these limits will not be tampered with or ignored by the major political parties. One was the Eastern question, the role of the Kurds in the political system. The other was religion. They agreed that they will not touch upon these two issues, which they considered to be highly dysfunctional for multi-party politics to emerge. Now, the Democrats stayed within this pact pretty much until the Republican People's Party began to sort of gnaw at the sides of these limits and dent them to a certain extent. In 1948, a new Republican People's Party was established under Mr. Günaltay's premiership or prime ministership. And this prime minister had been a graduate of the theology faculty of the Ottoman times, a theologian, a cleric. His religious credentials were touted and applauded vehemently by the major political figures and also press. And the Republican People's Party moved swiftly to close down one of the major projects of increasing the skill pool of the peasantry by providing them with education in the form of village institutes. And they came under enormous criticism by the right within the political party at the same time. And soon enough, the Republican People's Party succumbed to the pressure and accepted that these organizations, these educational institutions, should be closed down. In 1948, also the tombs of veneered members of the religious establishment of the past were open to visitation. First, of course, most important was the tomb of Ayub, a contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad, who allegedly had come to Istanbul or Constantinople and fought against the Byzantines and wanted to conquer the city, and he was martyred, died in this process of jihad. And his tomb in Ayub, on the southern shores of the Golden Horn, which you should visit at your leisure, and has a mosque there at the same time, had not been open to visitation until 1948. And that became possible by the decision of the Republican People's Party. Were these parts of the negotiated agreement between Bayar and İnönü? Anybody's guess. Didn't quite look like it. And there was also a lot of references being made to religion by the major newspapers from late 40s, early 1950s, who had been supportive of the Republican People's Party earlier. So it looked as if there was a party that cheated this negotiated pact, it was the Republican People's Party. In 1950, when the Democrats came to power, one of the first acts was to change the language of the azan, call to prayer, from Turkish to any other language. That's what the law says. But lo and behold, it became Arabic. No other language is being used, although the law does not permit any other language to be used. They did not necessarily introduce or reintroduce the Arabic Ezan. They simply lifted the ban on citing the Ezan or chanting the Ezan in Turkish alone. But in essence, it became the new standard of shifting it from Turkish to Arabic. And this had created, of course, a lot of conflict at the time, and various arguments back and forth had started to influence the relations between the political parties, and at the same time, various major figures of religious orders which had been banned and were not accepted as legal, suddenly to be recognized as respectful individuals by the Democrat Party. And they seem to have built good relations with these people, invited their disciples to take part in the Democrat Party organization, and eventually some of them to be elected as the members of the Democrat Party under these circumstances. So there was just a bit of relaxation on these matters as time went on, which resulted in considerable amount of clashes, etc. Then there had been many other moves about confiscating the property of the Republican People's Party on the grounds that they had been using state facilities. That created a big row. And also then afterwards, interesting new additions to laws were suggested by the Democrats. For example, one law which they initiated was the protection of Mustafa Kemal's name and heritage. Atatürk'ü Koruma Kanunu, as it is called in Turkish, was promulgated by the Democrat Party, not the Republicans. Although among conservative circles, occasionally people make these comments, forgetting that it's a Democrat Party project, not a Republican People's Party project. They also, for example, adopted new laws of not using the names of live individuals to name new buildings or new products or new accomplishments of the state. So a living individual's name could not be established on an airport or a stadium or a major opera house or whatever. The basic idea was to get rid of inner news names as many of them as possible. That law, to the best of my knowledge, I investigated that quite a bit and couldn't find a law that repealed it. It's still in effect. However, people's names, those who are living individuals' names, have been put on various buildings, starting with Kenan Evren. Kenan Evren Schools, who was the major leader of the 1980 coup and the General Chief of Staff of the Turkish military for a while, and also four-star general. And then 1980s, this continued. Turgut Özal's name was given to the hospital in Malatya, and this law was completely ignored, as if it didn't exist. Today, you even have, national team's coach Fatih Terim's name given to a certain stadium, as you very well know, at a time when his accomplishments are not so great, to tell you the truth. Well, this practice is continuing under the circumstances, with total negation of the law, as it seems. So a lot of these changes seem to give the impression that the Democrats and the Republicans were settling some accounts, in spite of the fact that the Democrats had vowed that they will not be looking for an opportunity to settle some accounts. Of course, some of these people, such as Bayar and Koraltan, had been well embedded in the Republican, or even before Republican, Ottoman Turkish nationalist İttihat ve Terakki movement, very much so. Bayar himself had functioned as a guerrilla leader in the War of Independence under the title of Galip Hoca. So he's been pretty much one of the front bench members of the Republican People's Party until 1945. He had been the Minister of Economy and then Prime Minister under Mustafa Kemal's leadership of the party and the presidency. So he was very close to Mustafa Kemal also. So it looks as if there was probably some kind of chemistry problem between İnönü and Bayar. They probably did not like each other very much. But beyond that, I mean, their ideology, their upbringing, their political careers, etc., were not that different. Bayar was a civilian, of course, whereas İnönü was not. But beyond that, there was not that much difference between the two. However, these two political parties soon enough moved into a level of relationship which is more like some kind of war. In fact, a political scientist who had analyzed Turkish politics of the 1950s, Frederick Frey, referred to it as no holds barred war. As the relationship between these two political parties. Now, until 1957, the Democrats did well. In fact, soon after they came to power in 1950, the weather was very favorable to large yields of agricultural produce. And Turkish growth rate jumped up to double digits, more than 10%, until 1954. And their vote share increased also, as the vote share of the Republican People's Party diminished. One went close to 60%, the other close to 40%. So there seemed to be a big difference now between the two political parties in 1954. However, in 1955, there was a recession in the Turkish economy. By 1956, it became difficult to find certain commodities. Turkey's imports again started to skyrocket as the country started to gain speed in economic growth, where exports could not match up with the increase in the imports, and the Turkish lira started to lose its purchasing power. And of course, there was a big pressure to devaluate under these circumstances. Not only inflation became a major problem, but also scarcity of goods and commodities began to be felt by large groups of people. So the government decided to pull the elections 1 year earlier, instead of 1958, usual 4-year period, to 1957. They went for election in 1957 because it was not possible to continue on with the same policies, and there had to be certain restrictions imposed on foreign trade, and at the same time, Turkish lira had to be devalued sharply. In fact, after the elections, Turkish lira was devalued 330% overnight, which took a big cut out of a lot of people's salaries and wages almost instantaneously. And that was a big, big loss for a lot of people. So under these circumstances, Democrats lost a lot of votes in 1957. If you listen to those Republicans who had participated in those elections as either voters or as candidates. Even today, they'll tell you that in 1957 elections, the Republican People's Party won the election, but the Democrats rigged it. And therefore, the relationship between the two political parties as of 1957 became even more poisoned. The Democrats, on the other hand, instead of seeing and admitting that the economic model that they had been following was not working, and it was the economy why the people changed their minds about supporting the Democrats, argued that the Democrats were the party of the people. How could these people ever vote for the Republicans again? Republicans are the party of the elite, the bureaucrats, the center. There was something wrong about it. They simply assumed that it was a conspiracy of the bureaucrats and the center, the good old center, against them that pushed the elections in the way that they did. So they tried to exact a punishment from the bureaucrats who they thought had played a major role against them in this period, which deteriorated the situation even further. And they became locked into some kind of fight with a lot of people. And in this period, overall performance of the Democratic government also suffered, as a lot of pressure began to mount on the press, which was heavily censored, and at the same time even the university professors, who, for example, could not teach a course on consumer inflation, which was considered politically too sensitive to be taught to the students. So some of those who taught inflation as part of the curriculum were removed from their positions in the universities. And that created a further problem. Of course, such other topics as civil liberties, human rights, etc., became increasingly difficult to teach. And some of these professors eventually became politicians. Most famous of them, for example, was Turhan Feyzoğlu, who became a very important politician in the 1950s, was assumed to be the new stellar leader of the Republican People's Party. He resigned his job in Ankara University and then moved into the Republican People's Party as he was interrogated about the courses he was teaching at this university. And it looked as if the universities and the government also were coming on head-to-head confrontation by 1958-59. And all of this erupted in student protests in 1959, which then culminated in a major student uprising in 1960, 28th of April 1960, which was again tried to be suppressed by the government, in which some students died, and many gossip started to scatter around, not of course on the social media where there was none. We didn't have the Twitter or Instagram or the internet for that matter at the time. So it was good old word of mouth, gossip. And gossip is the most ancient form of mass media that you can possibly have, and you can never have any control on it. And the government tried to control that at the same time, and that created even further pressure on civil liberties and rights of individuals. But the gossip expanded the kind of stories told about, what the government was doing to the university students. They were being killed. They were being made mincemeat or hamburger to be fed to the dogs, etc. So there were all sorts of these weird stories going around, which had further eroded the legitimacy of the government in the eyes of a relatively large number of people. Had they gone for early elections, perhaps in 1960, as they had done in 1957, they might have lost the elections, but Turkey would have saved democracy. They didn't do that. immaculate unionist. Bayar said, you know, under pressure, I will not succumb. I will not remove Menderes from the prime minister's position, and I will not go for early elections. Turkey went for a military coup. Of the young officers, 1960 coup was a young officers coup. It was not made against the government only, but against the establishment, the upper echelons of the military as well. Several thousand officers were evicted from the military, the top brass, and the chief of staff, the four-star general Rushdie Erdelhun, was also tried in martial law courts or extraordinary courts established in Yassada, and was found guilty and sentenced to death. His sentence was not executed by these young officers. And it's these young officers that moved swiftly to establish a constitutional assembly and remove the 1924 Constitution from effect, and in its place have a new constitution written by the university professors, mostly lawyers, who they believed would be able to do the job properly this time. So Turkey moved into the 1961 Constitution, which was negotiated by the representation of many political parties except for the Democrats, who had been on trial, which was another major flaw of the 1961 Constitution, because it did not represent all the political parties, not in full. There were some lower ranked members of the Democrats who had been invited to serve in the Constitutional Assembly, but they were in no position to represent the bulk of the organization. So the Democrats were virtually cut out of this deal. And as a result of which, after the Constitution and multi-party system was reinitiated in 1961, the followers of the Democrat Party argued that they were not part of this Constitution. They never accept the Constitution as legitimate, and they will not therefore find themselves bound by this Constitution, which is a major flaw, of course, of this Constitution. But the new Constitution also accepted the principle of legislative supremacy. However, it introduced many checks and balances, and it ended the practice of rule by strict majority, a form of majoritarianism, which had created a hegemony of the Democrat Party majority, which did not take into consideration any kind of sensibilities that the opposition was feeling and reacting to. And it deepened the relations between these fighting parties and made this cleavage very wide and very deep. And therefore, the Constituent Assembly of 1961 decided to somehow bridge these differences by establishing some kinds of checks and balances on the majority of the chamber of National Assembly. So what they did was to establish, first of all, a Senate, Senato, an upper chamber which would be, to a certain extent, checking and balancing the power of the lower chamber. The lower chamber would now be elected every 4 years. Upper chamber would be elected every 6 years fully, but there will be renewal of the 1/3 every 2 years. So it looked as if that the chances are that the Senate will not have the same kind of majority as the National Assembly. And therefore, getting the legislation through the Senate would require more compromises by the government. And therefore, the majority of the Grand National Assembly now had 2 tiers, one lower chamber and one upper chamber, not necessarily agreeing on every matter exactly. Of course, that slowed down the matters, but it had diminished the power of the National Assembly's majority considerably. Then, Constitutional Court was introduced. A court that would look into the constitutionality of the new laws and could strike down the laws for the first time. Turkey had no constitutional court until 1961. So this was introduced. And the higher courts, Danıştay, which was Şurayı Devlet in the past, Conseil d'État. Şurayı Devlet is the translation from French, Conseil d'État. It's an administrative court, looked into administrative conflict between bureaucrats and their masters, whether other bureaucrats or politicians. So all bureaucratic decisions could now be referred to administrative courts, and as a final appeals court, you had Danıştay, Conseil d'État. Yargıtay also functioned as a court of cassations, or Supreme Court as they call themselves, which looked into all kinds of appeals other than these administrative appeals which were assigned to the administrative court and Danıştay as such. And the Court of Accounts, Sayıştay, which had already existed, would function in overseeing the financial affairs of the state with greater powers and with more independence after 1961. So they gained new status. There were two bodies newly established: High Council of Prosecutors and High Council of Judges, which were put together after 1982, the elections of which occurred recently, and you heard a lot about them. And there's been an ongoing struggle about reverting them back to their previous status to a certain extent, and separating the judges from the prosecutors in their administrative matters. Then, of course, the idea of proportional representation was introduced into the system, which would undermine majoritarianism of the election results. Previously, the formula used in the elections was simple majority. In practice, it's plurality. The candidates or the party list that had the most votes won. That created a abnormally large majorities in the Grand National Assembly in comparison to the votes. For example, with about a little over 50% of the vote, the Democrats were able to control 89% of all seats in the Grand National Assembly. Almost double the percentage. And that diminished the size of the opposition far beyond the number of votes they got, or the proportion of votes they got. So with about 47% of the vote, they were able to get about 39 seats in the Grand National Assembly. So the opposition became enormously small, and that increased their radicalism, abrasiveness, and frustration, which diminished any chances of establishing any compromise between the opposition and the government, and a situation of no-holds-barred war emerged out of this. The two sides saw each other as the enemy, and they developed a view of the world as friend versus foe. And under these circumstances, relations became one of civil war, not regular political competition of people with different minds and different interests, for that matter. New institutions were established with autonomy, or autonomy was extended to old institutions. Universities became autonomous, no longer regulated and run by the Ministry of National Education. They had their separate administration. Inter-University Council, Üniversite Arası Kurul, was established, where universities would meet together and establish their own practices, which is still in operation side by side with the Higher Education Council. Universities were defined to be financially, administratively, and scientifically autonomous from the majority of the Grand National Assembly, so that the kinds of practices that had gone on in the 1950s of sacking professors for teaching regular subjects such as civil liberties or human rights, or economic growth and inflation rate, and making an analysis of the statistics revealed by the State Statistical Institute, and a virtual impossibility that these people would now be protected against the encroachments of the majority of the Grand National Assembly, who acts on partisan basis. Turkish Radio and Television Institution was established for the first time, which was defined to be, of course, an autonomous institution independent of the government. Central Bank, which had originally been established as an autonomous institution in 1931, was again defined to be of a better autonomous institution with enhanced autonomy. Once again, and several other agencies of the state were established as autonomous institutions, which had their own laws, own regulations, and people, so long as they acted within those laws, could no longer be sacked, arbitrarily punished, or ruled in that fashion. And these were all matters that provided for entrenched liberties and promotion of political participation. In 1963, Labor Minister Bülent Ecevit was credited with changing the law which enabled the trade unions to be established with greater ease and to become more effective. And therefore, Turkey lived between 1963 and 1980 a period of increasing vibrancy and effectiveness of trade unions, all of a sudden, at the same time, which has increased the role of participation in politics by the lower classes to a greater extent. And suddenly, the number of political associations, their activism in civic life, in politics, also in non-state affairs, mushroomed and increased very rapidly. So we lived a period of mushrooming of trade unions, civic associations, and civic activism. So that is what the 1961 Constitution provided. However, this did not necessarily lead to a more consolidated democracy for especially the right-wing former Democrats, and who followed down the same road later on, the Justice Party, declared all of this as illegitimate and unconstitutional. Bayar, who had also been sentenced in these courts established by the coup makers at the island of Yassada, one of the Princess Isles near Istanbul, to death among the 24 members of the Democrat Party. He survived. He came out of prison in the 1960s with the help of İnönü, and eventually wrote his memoirs. And in these memoirs, he said the difference between the 1924 Constitution and the 1961 Constitution is that in the 1924 Constitution, it's the people who ruled. In the 1961 Constitution, there is all these privileges provided to the center, all of these autonomous institutions, constitutional court, etc. To this day, therefore, the same argument has been made, promoted, touted by the conservative politicians in Turkey who have been arguing for an undiluted people power of the majority ruling the country with a heavy hand. For they assume that the majority will always vote for them, and they'll make sure that the majority continues voting for them for the foreseeable future. No compromise, no room for opposition, just a majoritarian hegemony under those circumstances. And they fought a very effective battle against this constitution from 1960s all the way to 1980, when Turkey had a new constitution after the military coup of 1980. All right, now, yesterday we looked into the basic characteristics of the 1961 Constitution or political regime. which was established as a reaction to what had gone on between 1945 and 1960. Those who drew up the Constitution operated with the assumption that majoritarian system based on majoritarian election laws with very few checks and balances, legally and constitutionally erected, resulted in the hegemony of a majority in the elections and also in the Grand National Assembly, which resulted in the breakdown of the democratic system in the country in 1960. In fact, they came to the conclusion that the country already had become a one-party dominant or hegemonic system, an authoritarian form of government by 1959, and only about a year later in 1960, 27th of May, young officers made a coup to topple the government, when obviously the government had been running into great difficulty running the country. Right before the coup, major cities of the country were put under martial law, which is a clear indication that the government was unable to run the affairs of the country in a stable civilian system. Not only the stability, but the civilian administration was in paralysis. And it's only a matter of slippery slope from the martial law operations in cities to a countrywide martial law operation, which eventually leads to a rule by the military, as it happened in 1960. The coup did not take a very long period of time to draw up the new rules of the game. And this time, the rules of the game, except for legislative supremacy, emphasize everything in the opposite of what had been practiced up until 1960. Majoritarianism was dropped, proportional representation was accepted, various checks and balances were erected, and various regulatory agencies were established. And many matters were taken out of the hands of the elected majorities and put under the jurisdiction of professional cadres, which the elected politicians, at least the right-wingers who had ruled the country earlier, resented pretty much. But at the same time, this new constitution enabled a broadening of the ideological spectrum. New political parties emerged, and they were able to get some votes, and the spectrum of ideologies represented in the Grand National Assembly increased in interesting ways. Now the Grand National Assembly started to accommodate a workers' party, a socialist party for the first time, eventually an ethnic nationalist anti-communist party, which was accused of being a fascist party for a while in the 1960s. And in the 1970s, also an Islamist party came into the government and the Grand National Assembly at the same time. In 1973, a coalition government between the Republican People's Party and the National Salvation Party included the champion of secular Republican policies, hand in hand with its diametrically opposite Islamist party in government. And the coalition experienced many difficulties and had great difficulty establishing itself and then running the country for very long. It collapsed at the end of 1974. But the political Islamists were this time able to establish a new coalition with the anti-communist ethnic Turkish nationalists, nationalist movement or action party, Nationalist Action Party, Milliyetçi Hareket Partisi, and also with the Justice Party, which had taken over the role of being the major moderate right-winger from the Democrat Party of the earlier era. So a three-party coalition was in charge until 1977. However, the relations under that coalition and the opposition CHP deteriorated both within the parliament and outside of it. And the Grand National Assembly started to run into great difficulty running the matters of the country. By 1980, it cannot even meet beyond taking a roll and then running the presidential elections with no successful result emerging from them until the military coup occurred on the 12th of September 1980 again, this time ending the more liberal form of political regime Turkey had experienced under the 1961 Constitution, and establishing a new regime which took the military this time about 2 years to establish, from 1980 until 1982. Again, the 1982 Constitution emphasizes legal. That's why I call it de jure. That's the Latin phrase for juristical or juridic or legal practice. So the legal principle of legislative supremacy. However, in practice, if you read the Constitution, it sounds as if a lot of leeway was given to the executive branch of the government, especially a new office of the president was erected, far beyond the powers of a regular president under a parliamentary system was entrusted with the presidency, the office of the president. Therefore, there was a de facto executive supremacy in practice. And the system functioned as such from 1983 onwards, when Turkey had another multi-party elections, which are neither fair, not very much free, to tell you the truth, somewhat like the rerun of the 1946 elections. But in the meantime, the Senate, which was considered by the authors of the 1982 Constitution as an unnecessary break on the system, too much of a complication for the checks and balances system of the country in operation. So they removed the Senate from existence, abolished it. The system went back to unicameral legislature. The Senate was not really based in the Turkish practice of the 1960s and 70s onto any understandable socio-political stratum or power relations in the country that emanated from that class or stratum in the society. In the practice of various democratic systems, an upper house, whether it's called a Senate or a Bundesrat or Chamber of the Lords or what have you, is established to implement a certain function in the system, which, due to some historical or other circumstances, is a necessity. In the British case, for example, the House of Lords had been established before the Commons became more important in the politics of Britain. And eventually, as the British bourgeoisie became more and more powerful, they were able to wring as much power as possible from the crown and the aristocratic upper classes, as they pushed them into the margins of the political system. They left them with the pomp of an upper chamber in the House of Lords, where they could enjoy some of the privileges, but not much of the influence. So by default, the House of Lords was converted into a sort of a honorable exit for the aristocracy in ruling Britain. In the American example of a Senate, it's the various states that are represented in the Senate equally. 2 senators representing each state, as big and populous as Texas or California, or as small as, without much population, as Rhode Island or Maine. Both are represented with 2 senators. It's the rights of the states and the federal design which acknowledges certain rights allocated to the lower echelons of power in the regions that are guaranteed by this kind of formulation. The same is true for the German federal example of the Bundesrat, where the various federal land are represented in the upper house. Every federal system has this dual representation. At the lower chamber, you have people represented on the basis of 1 man, 1 vote, or 1 man and women, 1 vote principle, where the constituencies are more or less equal in the number of voters voting per constituency, number of eligible voters per constituency, whereas in the case of the upper house, it is the land, the territory, the differences of culture, economic interests, etc., that are represented, and also powers entrusted with these lower echelons of power, regional, state, provincial authorities, are protected through the representatives of these parts of the whole in the upper house. In the Turkish case, the Senate did neither correspond with a upper class, an aristocracy, which Turkey never had. It did not correspond with a federal system where different parts of the country need to be represented on their own merit to protect the rights devolved to them through the constitutional design in a federal system. So the Senate really did not correspond with any major component of the system which need to be recognized in the power struggle in Turkish politics. So the removing of the system, removing of the upper chamber from the system of the legislature, did not necessarily create much of a problem. In fact, it was introduced with the hope that it will become a major balancing actor within the legislature by introduction of relatively more sophisticated, better educated people with longer careers in various walks of life, so that we would have a sort of a elitist-like upper class being represented in the Senate. Those who were to serve in the Senate were supposed to have more education, older, etc., than those who were serving at the National Assembly, the lower chamber, in the 60s and 70s. However, in practice, it did not really set root in the Turkish political system. So when removed, it didn't create much of a reaction. From time to time, we still hear some people voicing resurrection or reintroduction of the Senate in the legislature, but that really did not seem to have created much support for the idea. There was a big effort in 2012-13 for a new constitution, and the idea of Senate did not really emerge as one of those ideas that the political parties negotiating a new constitution really landed on or promoted under those circumstances. Yes, sir.
What do you think? Is it would be good to have a Senate in Turkey, or?
Again, you know, it doesn't necessarily correspond to any major component of the power struggle in Turkey, so it's not very clear what kind of a function the Senate would perform under any circumstance. It could be created to somehow democratize the Turkish electoral system, which is not necessarily a system that honors the one man, one vote principle of equality. For one of the major characteristics of a democratic system is equality. Equality before the law, or equal power of each individual that constitute the people. However, in Turkey, there is a severe violation of the one man, one vote principle in action since 1983, when Turkey, under this 1982 regime, started to practice elections. In 1983 original formulation, each of the 67 provinces, then Turkey had 67 provinces, now Turkey has 81. Each of the 67 provinces received one vote, irrespective of how many people live there, or irrespective of how many eligible voters resided in that province. So 67 seats were distributed across the landmass on the principle of one parliamentary seat per province. Then the total number of seats in the Grand National Assembly in 1983 were 400. Currently it's 550. Then it was 400. And the remaining 333 seats were distributed on the basis of the number of people living per province. So one man, one vote principle was applied only after 67 seats were distributed originally. This was carried out by the military government of the time with the presumption that those provinces with less population, who are more rural and more conservative, will have a more say in the Grand National Assembly. So they promoted conservatism of the rural folk, and also gave an edge to the right-wing politicians in the elections, which was not necessarily a fair practice. Turkey has still been practicing this unfair electoral system ever since. I have been arguing against it since then. At that point, I had made the objection, and still of the same opinion, that if they need to represent the provinces somehow in the Grand National Assembly, that has to be done through a Senate, a different body, in which we could have not one but perhaps 2 seats per province, and we can have 81 times 2, 162 seats in the upper chamber, Senate, and then one man, one vote, and distribute the votes according to the number of people living in each electoral district. Now, the way the population is distributed today in Turkey is concerned, there is now one province where there are not enough voters to elect a single seat in the Grand National Assembly of the 550. There are approximately 55 million eligible voters in Turkey above the age of 18. And there are 550 seats. So, simple arithmetic, you need about 100,000 eligible voters per seat. Well, for example, in the province of Bayburt, we don't have 100,000 voters. So it cannot be calculated as a electoral district. It has to be merged with another province, as had been the case in the past, and represented as a larger province. However, that is not considered as populistic enough, catering to the demands of people living in Bayburt, so they keep one seat. And that is the seat given to them, irrespective of the number of people who live there. And that, of course, represents Bayburt far more than any other province in Turkey. So one voter in Bayburt is sort of weighted against all the other voters throughout the system. And the voters' impact on the outcome of an election is less in Istanbul than it is in Bayburt, which is wrong for a democratic system. And that seems to be a major problem that is still continuing, even though we know that this is a problem, even though the politicians admit that, but they're not willing to tinker with that, because it looks as if it helps the winning party a bit, and therefore they are least inclined to change it, however undemocratic the practice may be. So only under those circumstances we could have had a Senate. We don't have it yet. And there does not seem to be any central reason why there should be any Senate. Now, in this system, the biggest novelty came with the presidency. Presidency is erected in the system as a sort of a superior vigilante of the system. Somebody with superior supervising powers who would check on the operation of the administrative system, of the public bureaucracy, and if there is anything that is not going according to the books, if there is any corruption, dysfunctionality, etc., the president can air this as an issue and has under his command a council of control, in fact it's called High Council of Control, Yüksek Denetleme Kurulu, which can be called into action by the president. They can investigate the matter and produce a report to the president, which could then be brought to the attention of the government, and the government could do something to solve the problem. So the presidency is now put in the position of becoming a check on the system, if not a full control or a balancing power. But at the same time, presidents used to have veto power over the legislation, and that power was still kept by this new presidency. So the presidents could veto the legislation and send the legislation back to the Grand National Assembly for a second reading. If in that case a majority votes again in favor of this legislation, the president cannot veto it a second time, but could refer it to the Constitutional Court if the president sees something unconstitutional about it. So in that sense, the presidency is also a control mechanism on the actions of the legislature. And the president is also given the additional power of intervening in the system directly if there is an emergency situation, an impasse of the legislature. For some reason, no new government could be established. Under those circumstances, the president gains some new powers to rule the country. In cases of an emergency, he can declare a state of emergency and can be influential in running the system. And at the same time, the president could, again under necessary circumstances, request the Council of Ministers to meet under his presidency, and he could then function as the Prime Minister would in the Council of Ministers, and could hold a meeting of the Council of Ministers and run the affairs of the day, and could be influential in the decisions being made in that council. Then he was also given a series of powers and authorities to decide on who to appoint as governors of a country, of the provinces of the country. Also approve of ambassadors to serve abroad, high court judges, constitutional court judges. The numbers have changed over time. In 2010, we had a new referendum in which the number of appointments made by the president is diminished and those made by the legislature increased. And at the same time, direct election in the case of the judiciary for certain critical institutions were introduced. So some tinkering in these laws, in the constitutional articles, have been made to sort of fine-tune the powers of the president, and somewhat diminished in this regard. But at the same time, he could also appoint the rectors of public universities, and on these ex officio decisions that the president made because he serves in the office of the president. Again, in Latin it is known as ex officio. In Turkish it's called resen. All those decisions, ex officio decisions made by the president, are final. They cannot be challenged even in a court of law. And the president holds no responsibility, politically or legally, for these decisions, ex officio decisions he makes. Appointing the rectors of public universities, for example. He is not to be held accountable for this decision that he made. All other decisions that he makes are countersigned by the Prime Minister and the related minister, whatever the domain of that decision may be. If it's a matter of national education, then the Minister of National Education. If it's a matter of finance, Minister of Finance, as well as the Prime Minister would undersign the same decision that the President makes, and those decisions, for those decisions, the President is still politically and legally not responsible. But the Prime Minister and the ministers are. They are held accountable. If something goes wrong and somebody has to give an account of that decision, the President cannot be called to account for it, but the Prime Minister and the ministers can. So the President is in a position like having a cake and eating it too. Above the Constitution, above the law, not controlled by any laws, except for the single accusation of treason, vatana ihanet in Turkish, which is not well defined in the criminal code, and we don't know how it can be implemented. Although you hear the word vatana ihanet, treason, every day in Turkey. Since it's not well defined, it's used very laxly. And I'm sure those of you who are not from Turkey have not heard this word being repeated so much in your own political systems. I lived for a long time in the United States and also in Britain. Never heard anybody talking so much about treason without any political or legal consequences. Not a day passes that the government accuses the opposition with treason, and the opposition accuses the government with treason, nothing happens. It looks as if it's a sort of a humdrum, trivial matter. Doesn't carry any weight. However, if treason can be proven in the previous law, before 2002, sentence would be death by hanging. So it looks as if it's a pretty serious crime. So the only way the president could be removed from office would have been on the basis of treason. On this case, the entire body of the Grand National Assembly should meet, all 550 members. 3/4 would approve of this decision and refer the president to the grand jury. And the Constitutional Court would now meet and try the president for treason. If found guilty, then he would be removed from presidency and then put to death before 2002. Now that the death sentence is abolished in Turkey, life imprisonment without parole. Now this doesn't look like a very easy thing to implement, to tell you the truth. So by all practical purposes, the presidents become quite invincible. And in 2007, due to the political struggle of the time, the current government, with the help of another government, another political party, which is pretty much defunct by now, although it exists in de jure terms, effectively it's not playing a major role, Motherland Party, pushed through the Grand National Assembly an amendment of the Constitution which enabled the people to elect a president in 2 rounds of balloting. And this was put to a referendum of the people on the 21st of October 2007. And in this referendum, 70% of the population participated, and 70%, almost 69 plus some percent of those who participated in the referendum voted yes. Turkish electorate loves to vote. What for, they don't quite know, not all the time, because when we ask them in surveys or when the journalists ask them, about the details of what they voted, it looks as if majority do not know, but they love to vote. So they, in the end, supported the idea, as a result of which, on the 10th of August 2014, Turkey has elected its second president with popular vote. The first president to be elected was elected in 1982 with that constitution, and it was the coup maker, the chief of staff, the former chief of staff, General Kenan Evren, who was also popularly elected, with 92% of the people voting in favor of him and 90% of the electorate voting in that election. So, that seems to be the record. So from now on, Turkey has another novelty accepted by popular vote through a referendum, which from 2007 onwards had initiated an elected president who is still politically and legally not responsible, unaccountable. The same definition still stands in the Constitution. Many pundits, politicians, academics, constitutional lawyers, political scientists, sociologists insisted that the Grand National Assembly do something about this. With an elected president, you have to have some kind of accountability, for it's a renewable term, 5-year tenure. So 5 years down the line in 2019, the current president will still run for a second term. Is he not going to account for his deeds during the first presidency to the people from whom he will be asking for votes? It's crazy. How can he be politically not accountable if he's going to rerun in an election? Of course, people will be asking for him to account for his deeds for the last 5 years. There's no other way. So the Constitution looks irrational right now, the way it stands. But still, there is a new president, elected by popular vote in the first round of the 2 rounds of elections on the 10th of August, with approximately 74% of the elected voting, 52%, a little less than 52% voting for the prime minister to become the next president. Well, the election law, which was promulgated in 2012, was not also very well designed or managed, for that matter. The law stipulated that the campaign for the presidency starts 60 days before the end of the tenure of the sitting president, the president in situ, legally speaking. Now, the president's term, the previous president's term, was ending on the 28th of August. So the process should have started at the end of June, 28th of June. However, the Election Council, or the Supreme Election Council, Yüksek Seçim Kurulu, announced the candidates on the 11th of July, 2 weeks into the campaign period. Until 11th of July, we didn't have official candidates. But the campaign should have started 28th or 29th of June, depending on how you counted the 60 days. It's a violation. Then the law says these candidates will announce their bank accounts, bank account numbers, to which people can make donations. Again, regulated. There is a calculation which establishes a ceiling beyond which you cannot make a donation. It's a little over 9,000 Turkish liras, roughly about 4,000 euros. That's the amount you can donate to a candidate. They will then spend this money and give an account of it to the Council of Election Council. I'm sorry. Good. But those accounts were also not declared until the 11th of July. So they could not have practically spent any money on the campaign, right? Wouldn't that be the case? I mean, how can you spend any money if you don't have money in the accounts until 11th of July, when the accounts became public information, right? Wrong. The prime minister of the country, who was running to become the president, made a lot of expenditure in between. Propagating for his presidency as the prime minister. It is a problem. What are regulations for if they're not going to be implemented? That's the basic problem. So the opposition asked, you know, how did you spend this money before 11th of July? They calculated that he should have spent about 300 million Turkish liras worth of money. Where did this money come from? According to the regulations, it is illegal to spend public funds for the campaign of any candidates. Number one problem. Or funds of the political party. That is why there will be an account for the candidate in which donations will be made, from which the candidate would make the expenditure. None of this is investigated. These are all bad odors. There's something of a problem that is lurking out there, which has to be fixed by the Grand National Assembly. So this election was not, again, a fair election, where the rules did not seem to have applied to each candidate equally. Some of the candidates were permitted to cheat the laws and go around the rules, make expenditures, while others could not. That is not a fair election. If not a fair election, then it's not a democratic election. That's the problem. But having been elected, the candidate who was elected didn't mind. The electorate did not mind. The opposition did not mind very much either. So we have this awful practice now staying on the books as not necessarily a good example of running a fair and democratic election. Unfortunate as it may be, it's a big problem. I'm not so sure whether this will be fixed, when it will be fixed, and how it will be fixed. Yes, ma'am.
Is it allowing people to run for an office while having another office? Because I think
That's a good question. The law says that, you know, the president, once elected, severs all ties with his political party and loses, if he or she has a seat, the seat in the Grand National Assembly. That's written into the Constitution. However, there's nothing which indicates that the candidate must resign that seat in the Grand National Assembly or sever ties with a political party before running as a candidate. There's nothing indicated in the election law about the candidate to resign from public office before becoming a candidate for the presidency either. It's been argued that members of the Grand National Assembly run to become mayors of certain provinces, certain major cities in provinces, without being, without severing their ties with the Grand National Assembly. In fact, they participate in the parliamentary elections without resigning their seats during the campaign. And the prime ministers also participate in the re-election campaign of prime ministers without vacating the seat. So why do it? But that was also discussed at length. The opposition insisted that the prime minister resign the seat to be equal with the other candidates. He refused. And the election council on this matter did not pass a judgment that is detrimental to the prime minister. So I assume they don't have to do that. However, after election, it became another major agenda issue. For the Constitution says very clearly, when the new president is elected, his ties with the political party will be severed, and he will automatically lose his seat. Now the question is, when was he elected? Obviously, official election is the announcement of the results in the official gazette by the High or Supreme Election Council, Yüksek Seçim Kurulu. Yüksek Seçim Kurulu announced the results in the official gazette on the 13th of August 2014. And the prime minister who got elected did not resign either his position in the Grand National Assembly or sever his tie with his political party until he became the president. Opposition said foul. Justice and Development Party deputies, including constitutional lawyers, came out and said, "Oh, what is in this? Why should he resign? You know, since he's the prime minister, he could at least stand there." Now, not only did he not resign any of these seats, but he handpicked his successor in the political party to become the next party leader and the prime minister, who was adopted without any debate in the Justice and Development Party convention, with 99.9% of the delegates voting for him, not one even criticizing, and there was not a single contest. It looked almost as if we were watching the North Korean Communist Party Soviet Supreme, in essence. You know, it didn't look very democratic, to tell you the truth, the whole process. However, nothing can be done on this matter. The only body who can do anything about it, well, there are two bodies. One is, of course, the Grand National Assembly, and the other is the Higher Supreme Council of Elections. They can simply abolish the election and then rerun it. They could have done it, but they didn't do so. Yes?
But is the High Supreme Council of Elections also picked by the president? Because you told that the High Court or Higher Court of
That shouldn't make any...
picked by the president?
That shouldn't make any difference because these are all judges. They're supposed to be applying the law, and they're not supposed to be partisan.
Yeah, but if he picks them...
But if the opposition had decided that there was any problem with this council, they should have pointed it out much earlier in time. They did not see any problem in the character of these individuals who were picked under these circumstances. But that doesn't matter. All of these people, as I will go into later on into detail, their careers are deeply influenced by the decisions of the Higher Council of Prosecutors and Judges, which operates under the heavy shadow of the Minister of Justice, which is a member of the parliamentary party group of the government party. So it's controlled by the executive anyway. So these judges will eventually be judged by this Higher Council of Prosecutors and Judges, which is controlled by the executive branch of the government. So there is such control over it. Anyway, so it's not fully independent of executive influence.
Doesn't have the opposition in the GNA have the right to launch an investigation?
They had done so, but since it's majority vote, they don't have the majority. So it's voted down very easily. So we are stuck there, and now we have something like an sort of a untold conflict or crisis between the president and especially parliamentary opposition. And that is simmering, and it will blow up from time to time. There are other problems attached to it because he has taken a vow, an oath, for neutrality. And then he declared that he will not abide by neutrality principle in his actions, and he has not abided by neutrality. He started to attack personally the leader of the Republican People's Party, which is again a clear violation of Article 103 of the Constitution. Is that cause for treason? I wouldn't think so. I wouldn't believe that it's treason. So they can't move to sort of impeach him if that is not considered as a treasonous act. So under those circumstances, not much can be done. But what we have is a serious problem. So that makes the next election in 2015 very critical. Because the minute AKP loses its majority in the Grand National Assembly, we will have a full-blown crisis with the presidency and with the new government. Whoever comes to govern Turkey, other than Justice and Development Party, if that happens, will have a huge problem with the president. And Turkey will be involved in a constitutional or presidential crisis of some sort in the future. Even if that doesn't happen, then there will be a serious set of problems between the executive and the judiciary and also the legislature, eventually, under these circumstances. So the way the system has operated has produced an outcome with the full participation of the people, which is not necessarily less messy than what we had in the past, when the parliament, as part of a parliamentary procedure, was electing the president of the country. So nothing is solved. The situation is made even more complicated, and we're now looking for another major crisis of one sort or another. And of course, the current president has also committed himself to a constitutional amendment or a new constitution of what he called Turkish-style presidentialism, or Alaturka presidentialism, as I prefer to call it, which sounds like a presidentialism, and he said it in these words, without any checks and balances. That is authoritarianism, as far as I know. No checks and balances, you can't talk about democracy. That's the big problem. And under those circumstances, of course, Turkey will have another even bigger regime crisis coming up after the next election, if he attempts to do that.
But didn't you say that the president already has no real checks and balances?
Well, it's watered down, checks and balances, let's put it that way. Already the president, yes, president has very limited checks and balances on him. The biggest checking institution would be the executive branch of the government, the rest, the prime minister. If the prime minister decides to make sure that the president doesn't get involved in partisan politics, he can do it, as we have seen in the past. So there is an effective mechanism, but the prime minister is opting not to do so currently. So we seem not to have much of a check and balance on him. The opposition in the Grand National Assembly is also playing such a role right now. How effectively can be a matter of debate. Some press and the media is doing that. And of course, the people in general are to a certain extent doing that, civil society to a certain extent. But none of these are very strong checks and balances on the system. The current system is not very sustainable, and we have to make a decision of either creating a presidency that conforms to the standards of parliamentary regime of democracy, or some form of authoritarianism with the current president. That's the real choice waiting for Turkey in 2015, unfortunate as it is. So this year is going to be very, very interesting for all of us. And we already see some signs of that happening in Turkey currently. So the presidency is an important aspect of the new system, which has increased the power of the executive branch of the government. And that's what I mean by executive supremacy, where the executive seems to have considerable of power if a parliamentary group controls the majority of the seats in the Grand National Assembly, especially if they have an overwhelming control over the majority of seats in the Grand National Assembly. And then, at the same time, if the president is from the same political party, then the executive becomes enormously powerful, and an unbalanced relationship occurs between the executive branch of the government and the other branches of the government. The legislature becomes unimportant, irrelevant in most matters, and the judiciary could come under the great pressure of the executive branch of the government, and the standards of Turkish democracy suffers dearly under these circumstances. We're experiencing through that right now. But this is not something that is created by the current government. This was something that was created by those who wrote the Constitution in 1982 originally. For they were motivated by the events of the 1960s and 70s, where there was something like a civil war. They believed that the main reason why this happened was a fragmented nature of politics, which created coalition governments, which were ineffective to rule the country. So they wanted to have an effective rule of the country by one strong prime minister. Instead, now they seem to have one strong president and not so strong prime minister to settle for right now. And we don't know what it'll going to evolve into in the meantime. And that is now creating a potential for increasing authoritarianism and decreasing democracy, the standards of democracy in the country, and therefore we're having great trouble with, keeping the system within bounds of democracy currently. And this is, of course, creating a major problem. Now, in this pristine form, for this Constitution was amended several times in 1993, 1995. then again in 2000s, in 2002, 2004, after Justice and Development Party had come to power, but still operating within the realm of democracy and was trying to establish compromise. The 2004 amendments had various political parties participating in it, including the main opposition Republican People's Party, so they did it with compromise. From 2007 onwards, all amendments were made by confrontation, in 2007 and 2010 by a referendum. So approximately 2/3 of this constitution had been amended by the civilians who came to power after 1983. And they started amending the constitution effectively from that point onwards. Now these amendments have changed the very nature of the constitution. Originally it was less democratic. It's made for a more liberal type of, and therefore more democratic type of constitution in essence. One major area that had been curtailed and confined tremendously in the original 1982 formulation was political participation, which had been assumed to be a major problem of Turkey, creating instability in the system, eventually leading to clashes between civic associations, leading to something like civil war. So the authors of the 1982 Constitution, the military mainly this time, not like the 1961 Constitution where the lawyers, especially constitutional lawyers from universities, had a big say. This time it was the military who had the biggest say, had decided to curtail political participation as much as possible. They made it illegal for political parties to establish youth and women's associations. Also, they were curtailed from establishing village-based partisan organizations, only in small towns and larger units. They also outlawed university students and professors from becoming involved in civic associations of any kind. In the case of university professors, no membership in the political parties. Also, university students. That way they thought that these people would not become partisan ideologues in the system. Not necessarily terribly correct. And all of this associational involvement of these people, especially university professors, were left to the written approval of the presidents of the universities. Without them, no membership would have been possible. All of this changed over time through these amendments. Political activism was considered as a form of insurgency, not as a functional force, but a dysfunctional force. As the events of the 1970s seem to have indicated. It was true that Turkey went through a period of student activism and uprising. Students revolted in 1968-69. That was a global wave at the time. Student revolt started in California, United States. Had something to do with, of course, the Vietnam War and the overall opposition to Vietnam War by the American students at the time. Traveled through the US, and they clashed with the authorities, the police, and also the National Guard. In Kent State, Ohio, 4 students were killed by the National Guard in their confrontations. So it had become bloody by 1967-68. Traveled across the Atlantic into Britain, Germany, and France. All of them erupted in student uprisings. In 1968, especially the French student uprisings were enormously effective, paralyzed the capital, and Still to this day, we don't know what would have happened had the Communist Party decided to participate in their student revolts. They did not. But it was finally the French army who intervened in Paris, cleared up the campuses, and also cleaned up the city, which had been buried under garbage, for about a month or so. And there was complete paralysis of the system. The system, it was so severe that one of the French heroes of the 20th century, General Charles de Gaulle, had to flee to Germany as the president of the country. Or he officially argued that he went to Germany to see that the French troops were doing well there, and in case of an emergency, they would be used against the students. Georges Pompidou, who was the prime minister at the time, gave an interview. He died suddenly of cancer, therefore he didn't have an autobiography published by him or his memoirs, so we don't know. But in this interview, he argued clearly that the president went out of the country without letting him know. That, to me, sounds like fleeing, not going to Germany for a visitation of the French troops there. For Pompidou argued that he called Élysée, the palace where the president lives. Nobody knew where he was. Talked to Mrs. de Gaulle. She didn't know where he was. He went to this small village where he used to go in times of crises, Colombey de les Églises, close to Paris, a small village. He went there and talked to his friends in the village, the villagers. They said, well, he came here about 15 days ago. We had a nice time with him, but we haven't seen him since. There was crisis. According to the French Constitution, the only way that they could move forward was with the president. So he called French constitutional lawyers, asked them what to do under these circumstances. The general is gone. Constitution says he has to decide. If I decide, would that be a violation of the Constitution? According to the interview, the constitutional lawyer said yes. Goody. That's good for perhaps democracy, but bad for good government. So under these circumstances, there was a full-fledged crisis. That is the level that student revolts had taken place in 1968 in France. They impacted Egypt in the spring of 1968, right after the French student uprising. In June, Turkey. Major campuses erupted in student uprisings. So it looked as if it was a culturally diffused phenomenon running around the globe, and then several other places. They were mostly peaceful. The students' demands were mostly legitimate. Their criticisms were scathing but true in most occasions. What they demanded was reform of the educational system, which they thought was defunct, antiquated, and not preparing the students for the contemporary world. Eventually, the university authorities engaged with the students, were successful in placating them, but it continued into 1969 and into 1970. In 1970, finally, it was taken out outside of the campuses, and certain buildings were attacked by students, and it became a major phenomenon for all major cities of the country. On the 12th of March 1971, there was another military coup by memorandum, which did not suspend the Grand National Assembly, but pushed the government into resignation. And sort of a quasi-military technical government was established on the 12th of March 1971, which continued until 1973 when we had gone back to multi-party elections again. Now we know from the Marshall Court hearings during this period that quite a few of those who acted as if they were students were agents provocateurs of the state. They pushed the students out of the campuses. They provided violence to delegitimize the student movement. They were very successful at that. In 1975, they repeated the same phenomenon. It got out of hand. And it had an indelible mark in the minds of people, especially those who never attended universities, that universities are awful places for young people who get ready for uprising. It is as if we get such an instruction as students, or give you such instruction to rise up against the authorities for a while. So there was a lot of hostility coming out of the public in general about the way universities were handled. And that is reflected on the way the Constitution was written, which curtailed public activism and inhibited students from taking part in civic associations. There was considerable amount of discouragement of the students by their parents, by their family members, and also university administrations were very keen on not to be seen as engendering some kind of activism in civic life among students, which could easily be misunderstood, misinterpreted, and be based for illegitimate accusation against them. So from 1980s up until the end of 90s, when there was some improvement in the constitutional amendments and then also in the other legislation, that this atmosphere started to change a little bit. But you should also take into consideration that if you are to practice and learn civic activism, university is one of those places where you will have student associations, where you will be discussing, debating public issues, where you will learn how to talk to a group of people, how to come together, form platforms, press for certain changes in the practices of certain forms of administration, how to contact public authorities, and the like. It should be part of education, but nothing of the sort could be encouraged or given. That is, of course, a curbing influence on civic activism in the country in general, to tell you the truth, in essence. So this Constitution was the diametric opposite of the former 1961 Constitution, which was highly liberal, and this was highly conservative in its essence. Now the electoral system, which is probably as important as the Constitution, defining a regime, which has adopted the formula of a Belgian mathematician by the name of D'Hondt, who suggested a largest average formula, which Turkey adopted in 1961 and has stuck with it ever since, has been using it systematically over all this period of time. There's a simple formula. I'll go into details when we look into voting practices in Turkey. It produces a proportional outcome, that the vote shares and seat shares of political parties are usually distributed, if you follow it strictly, in a rather proportional way. A political party that gets about 52% of the vote gets about 53, perhaps 54% of the seats in the parliament. And a party that gets about 40% of the vote may get about 40% or 39% of the vote. So the winner is, to a certain extent, rewarded, but in a relatively moderate way. However, this time, the military authors of the Constitution decided to introduce a 10% national threshold for political parties to qualify for a seat in the Grand National Assembly. Any party that didn't get the 10% of the vote will have all the votes down the drain. 9.99, you don't make it. You don't even get one seat. Only those that go above 10% are put in a pool, and then their votes are transferred into seats according to Don's largest average formula. Now that produced enormous mismatches between distribution of votes and distribution of seats. It looked as if the system was paying some attention to representation, but in practice it's working as if it were a majoritarian system, giving huge boosts to the major political parties and suppressing all new political parties from coming to life unless they are absolutely popular. 10% of the vote is a lot of vote. We're talking about the vicinity of 4 to 5 million voters voting for you. Not a small number. And amassing that kind of vote is not necessarily easy. Currently, only 3 political parties can go over 10% in Turkey today. So that obviously creates for a less fragmented Grand National Assembly currently. However, when there is indecision among the people, of course, you may have more political parties going over 10%. We had 5 political parties going over 10% at one point in time, where the vote was distributed almost evenly across them. 20%, 19%, 15%, 14%, 12%, you know. Then you get an even distribution. And that results in a fragmented parliament, and that is a formula or recipe for coalition governments, obviously. However, this was introduced as a system, proportional representation after 10% threshold, to decrease the number of political parties in the Grand National Assembly. Again, it was a phenomenon practiced between 1961 and 1980 in Turkey, where there was no threshold at the national level. We had the D'Hondt formula producing proportional distributions of the votes and the seats. And that was resulting in a highly fragmented parliament with 7, 8, 9, 10 political parties, and of course creating a necessity of establishing and running coalitions. So there's nothing wrong with coalitions, as you very well know. Some countries are only run by coalitions. For example, Germany, after 1947, was run only for 4 years without a coalition. They're always ruled by a coalition. They've done well. Economically, they're the 5th largest economy in the world, largest in the European Union. And they could be managed by a coalition. No problem. Some countries have had multi-party coalitions. Italy, for many years, they had multi-party coalitions, sometimes 6, 7, 8, 10 parties in coalition. That was no problem for Italy. It also is one of the 3rd largest economy in Europe, has its problems, but can run its affairs by this coalition party very easily. In fact, Joseph LaPalambara from MIT, Boston, Massachusetts, United States, wrote a book, Politics Italian Style, in 1987. In which he argued that Italy is so democratic that they don't even need a government. They can rule themselves, by themselves, without any government, under those circumstances. I'm not going to go that extreme, but in essence, on the average, many countries in Europe, some in Asia, such as India, for example, have been managing their affairs by coalition government, and very effectively doing so. Yet there is a huge antipathy for coalition governments in Turkey. And as a result of which, this idea of 10% threshold, which would make coalition government difficult, was sold with zeal to the people in general and to the political elites, in essence. However, that has created a situation in which, for example, the Motherland Party, with about 34% of the national vote, was able to get about 65% of the votes, of the seats in the Grand National Assembly in 1987. A similar outcome, with about close to 35% of the vote, Justice and Development Party in 2002 was able to get about 65% of the seats in the Grand National Assembly. Total imbalance. Huge disproportionality of vote distribution with seats distribution. And that does not necessarily bode well with across the aisle relations in the legislature between the government and the opposition. That creates circumstances for conflict, but does not necessarily push these political parties for compromise and working together for the same kind of goals, and improves the chances of opposition from developing under these circumstances. We have a culture, as you very well know, a political culture, which does not have much room for political opposition anyway. Historically, political opposition has always been problematic. And now we have an election system which produces overwhelming majorities by political parties that get a certain distribution of the vote, which then can treat the opposition unfairly, stigmatize it, suppress it, make them look illegitimate very easily. And that does not necessarily improve the democratic standards of the country. Besides, this may have eluded you so far, but coalition government is peculiar to democracy only. No other form of political regime has room for coalition government. Can you have coalition government in People's Republic of China, Cuba, North Korea? That's crazy as an idea. No such thing is possible. Coalition governments can only occur in democracies. The question then becomes, if you hate coalition government, what do you think about democracy? Are you in love with democracy? We're not very sure of that either. Yes? To make sure that the parties on the fringes at the time were the Nationalist Action Party, MHP, and the National Salvation Party of the 1970s, would not get to play a major role in the making and running of coalitions ever again, because they were assumed to be too far out there on the right to make democracy work and give the moderate political parties more chance of becoming the governing party alone. They had assumed that it would enable the moderate political parties, one on the right and one on the left, to alternate between government and opposition if they introduce a 10% threshold.
They couldn't just, they knew that they would get like 8%, they couldn't just choose 5%.
Yes, that's what they did not want. They did not want to have these political parties to have any representation. But what happened? The National Salvation Party converted itself into a welfare party, became the political party that had the most votes in 1995, getting 21% of the vote. Too bad. 10% with it away. Nationalist Action Party got 18% of the vote in 1999. It's one of the major political parties today. And the major right-wing political parties, Justice Party, who had vacated its position, to True Path Party, is pretty much gone. It resulted in the collapse of the moderate right wing in Turkish politics. It enabled the extremes of 1970s to conquer the moderate positions and become the dominant political forces right now. And that is the result of constitutional engineering by the military. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's where we are now, under these circumstances. So it's thanks to them that the more extreme political parties have found opportunities to get rid of the less extreme ones and impose their will upon the system and become the dominant forces of Turkish politics. Of course, other circumstances also help them, as we will see eventually in time. So this kind of engineering did not necessarily help much under those circumstances. Is 10% undemocratic? European Court of Human Rights says no, it isn't. But there are two goals in an election system. One is just representation. Another is government accountability, or ease of government formation. European Court of Human Rights has argued that under the circumstances Turkish government operates, it's good enough for Turkey to implement this threshold and emphasize government accountability. Is this constitutional? I'm not a constitutional lawyer. Therefore, you can take my argument with a grain of salt. But I have argued that with constitutional lawyers. My reading of the Article 67 of the Turkish Constitution, on the basis of the interpretation the European Court of Human Rights made, renders this election law unconstitutional. For the Article 67 says that Turkish election law should find a compromise between government accountability and proportional representation. European Court of Human Rights says it doesn't. It emphasizes government accountability to the detriment of just representation. So the representation goal is not compromised with government accountability. So the Article 67 is violated by this election law. I've argued this in academic circles, in public, on television, in various networks, in Turkey, outside Turkey, and anyway, it stays on there. Why? Because the majority of the Grand National Assembly believes that 10% helps them to keep their seats. For in a legislature, the most important goal of a legislator, individual, a deputy, is to get re-elected. They'll do anything to get re-elected. Anything. Hopefully anything legal. Hopefully anything moral. But that's not a necessity. 10%, they believe, ensures that they will get elected. So they don't want to let go of it. And in fact, the current government criticized everything about the Constitution and the political laws enacted by the military, except this. You couldn't hear one single word of criticism against them, against this principle coming from the government. So, under these circumstances, we can assume that, this practice will continue for a long while to come. Yes, sir?
Independent candidates can get elected less than
Non-party candidates can, yes, independent individuals. And that's what the Kurdish nationalists have been doing. They're fielding independent candidates, and then once they get elected, they get a representation as a political party in the Grand National Assembly if they are more than 20. That's what they've been doing. Any other political party can do that, no problem. But as a political party, they are not represented as such, which again is unfair. I mean, democracy has many rules. You have to either live by them or then tarnish your image. So the image is terribly tarnished so far as this is concerned. So the Constitution in and of itself has many problems. For it has produced a new kind of political regime which I call Neo-Hamidian. You remember the good old Hamidian regime that we talked about a century ago? We have managed to recreate it in a new form. You may call it neo-conservative. Doesn't matter. So far as I'm concerned, I'll be happy. But this is very Turkish, so I call it Neo-Hamidian, in essence. For it looks as if you have a contemporary political regime in a written constitution. Fine. It looks as if you have a running democracy written into books. Fine. But you don't have politicians who necessarily abide by these rules or laws or act accordingly. Completely disregard them and act arbitrarily and get away with it. That's Hamidianism. That's what Abdul Hamid did. There was a constitution. He used the constitution to suspend the legislature from operation for 33 years. They were in recess for 33 years. How about that? You know, that's the problem. In the Constitution, there is a legislature, written, well ingrained, but in action, nothing of the sort exists. The same is to a certain extent, or a great extent, true today. You have an executive that acts as if the Constitution doesn't exist. Heeds it whenever the Constitution fits his or her basic goals. Otherwise, can be easily ignored. Just like the traffic signs in Istanbul, you know. They are just sculpture that creates color to our city. You know, nobody knows what they are, and nobody heeds them, but they exist. That's the difference. The de jure system and the de facto system are disjointed. De facto system is based on personal loyalties, intimate relations, brotherhood solidarities, religion comes into play, and you just have certain relations established on various grounds, and you work with close confidence, removed from the established practices of public bureaucracy and the law, totally arbitrarily, in a personalistic style, and decide on your own, and may use at most the rubber stamping of the legislature if that need be. That's as far as it goes. And this regime is therefore a form of regime that Turkey invented by the 1982 Constitution in the very throne of the president, actually. I see the current president living up to this role in that sense. Not to the letter of the Constitution, but to the spirit. He is Abdul Hamid reincarnated, in a sense, as such, acting similarly. He moved the palace from Dolmabahce to Yıldız. Erdogan moved the presidency from Çankaya to Atatürk Orman Çiftliği, Beştepe as it's called nowadays. Build a new one, huge palace, living there instead. With his close confidants, close associates, counselors, advisors, he decides on all these matters, enacts them, instructs the executive to carry these through. And this seems to be happening in spite of the fact that the letter of the Constitution is different. So the two gets disjointed, dissociated, and severed from each other. And in essence, therefore, this becomes an illegal system, if not illegal, from time to time. And in practice, it gives a lot of room for arbitrary decision-making and action. And at the same time, it creates for a system which has a relatively large proclivity for excessive use of physical force on people. In Turkish, this is called ceberrut. It's a ceberrut system. It's built on forceful persecution, pressure. And these characteristics have become well established and has become a predictable, recurrent pattern, and in the way to becoming institutionalized as the system evolves further along these lines. And the practice will continue until and unless Turkey has a new liberal constitution, which looks like an extremely long shot right now.